Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating and honestly pretty radical blueprint for completely redesigning how our society functions. This isn't just about tweaking a tax code or passing a single new law. We're going to look at a comprehensive, mathematical, and structural proposal for a totally new kind of economy. It's a concept drawn directly from a really thought-provoking paper on designing a post-growth, market-based society with built-in protections. Now, whether you lean left, right, or somewhere in the center, the ideas we are about to unpack are going to challenge our most basic assumptions about work, survival, and power. And hey, if some of these concepts sound a bit startling at first, that is completely normal. Just stick with me, because as you'll see, the math behind this is surprisingly pragmatic. Let's jump right into it.
So to really grasp this blueprint, we first have to understand the specific problems it's trying to solve. The paper starts by outlining the structural flaws of late-stage capitalism. It notes that unchecked capital accumulation naturally leads to monopolies, wage stagnation, and ultimately the capture of political systems by corporate interests. But, and this is key, the paper also firmly rejects the historical alternative. Authoritarian central planning is highlighted as a complete disaster. Centralized state-run economies are just totally incapable of processing localized information, which leads to chronic shortages. Worse than that, centralizing all coercive authority in the state basically just replaces corporate oligarchs with state bureaucrats, making the whole system incredibly vulnerable to tyrannical capture. So, we clearly need a completely new approach, a third way to save the dynamic, decentralized magic of markets, but without all the exploitation.
Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the twin economic failures, how to guarantee a survival floor, the dynamic wage subsidy, price guardrails, and finally, upgrading democracy. Let's begin.
All right, Section 1, the twin economic failures. Finding a path beyond endless accumulation and state tyranny. As we just saw, the authors argue that we really have to move past the failed extremes of the 20th century, and the foundation of this new blueprint is something called post-growth economics. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. Abandoning infinite GDP growth sounds economically terrifying, right? It kind of feels like giving up on progress entirely. But the paper suggests this shift is absolutely necessary, primarily because infinite physical expansion is biophysically impossible on a finite planet. It fundamentally re-engineers the overarching objective of our economy. Rather than pursuing endless growth, which the authors argue reduces human life to just a mere instrument of capital, the explicit goal here becomes human flourishing, community cohesion, and leisure. The framework actually draws a lot of inspiration from the structural equilibrium of traditional indigenous societies, like the pre-colonial Hawaiian system. And listen, this isn't about accepting poverty or lowering our standard of living. Not at all. It's about optimizing efficiency. In those indigenous models, necessary communal survival tasks are completed with maximum efficiency, specifically to free up vast windows of time for collective leisure, sports, and spiritual rejuvenation. The ultimate goal? Decoupling our basic human survival from exploitative labor.
Moving on to Section 2, guaranteeing a survival floor, decommodifying human existence. To actually decouple survival from labor, the authors propose decommodifying human existence entirely. And they want to do this not through traditional welfare tracks, but through a highly efficient baseline. Okay, let's dive into this. The paper introduces what it calls the Core Octet, or Universal Basic Services. These are 8 fundamental needs provided unconditionally to everyone. We've got nutritious food delivered via local co-ops, clean water managed as a public trust, clean air secured by municipal protections, universal single-payer healthcare, lifelong public education, dignified clothing through community textile co-ops, uncommercialized public spaces free from hostile architecture, so, no more park benches intentionally designed with spikes or dividers just so someone can't sleep on them, and finally, safe nonprofit shelter to remove housing from speculative financial portfolios. Now, if you're feeling a little skeptical about providing all of this unconditionally, consider the underlying logic here. True free market participation is only actually free if you aren't participating under the immediate threat of starvation or homelessness. By unconditionally guaranteeing these basic physical and social needs, you actually maximize personal freedom. You completely remove the threat of coercion from the market, making work a genuine choice for advancement rather than a desperate scramble for basic survival.
Section 3, the dynamic wage subsidy, upgrading the engine of commerce. All right, this is where we pivot to a really pragmatic mathematical solution for the private sector. You might be wondering, if basic survival is covered, how do businesses actually function and pay living wages without just going bankrupt? Well, the paper rejects flat minimum wages because they can really hurt small businesses, and it also rejects flat guaranteed incomes because they can distort the labor market. Instead, the state deploys this incredibly elegant, dynamic wage subsidy. Here's how it works. The state calculates a target wage, represented here by the variable WT, which is set at exactly 80% of the national median hourly rate, represented by WM. This ensures that the target is always tied dynamically to the actual real-world economy, constantly adjusting as median wages shift around.
Let's break down how this actually plays out mathematically. The state directly subsidizes 80% of the gap between what an employer pays out of pocket and that target living wage we just mentioned. And that money gets injected straight into the worker's paycheck. So for example, let's say the national median wage is $20 an hour. That means the target wage is set to $16. If an employer pays a legally mandated base wage of, say, $7.25, the government steps in and covers 80% of the difference between that $7.25 and the $16 target. This effectively lowers the cost of labor for small businesses while massively increasing the take-home pay for the worker. It's a win-win.
Now, for the pragmatists out there, I know exactly what you're thinking. Won't people just game the system? Well, the paper actually steelmans this objection beautifully with a self-enforcing anti-fraud mechanism built directly into the math. Let's say a shady employer tries to declare a fake job paying $0 an hour just to harvest that government subsidy. Because the employer is legally required to pay a minimum out-of-pocket base wage of $7.25 to even qualify for the program, the absolute maximum subsidy the government will ever disperse for the gap is strictly capped at $7. Think about that for a second. You would literally have to pay $7.25 out of your own pocket just to illegally harvest $7 from the government. It is structurally unprofitable to commit fraud. Plus, because the subsidy covers 80% and not 100% of the wage gap, it preserves really clear incentives for upward mobility. Whenever you get a raise from your boss, your final take-home pay always goes up. There is absolutely no welfare cliff here.
Section 4. Guardrails against price siphoning. Protecting the purchasing power of the people. So the next logical fear when you inject cash into workers' pockets is inflation, right? Won't landlords and massive corporations just raise their prices to absorb all that new money? The blueprint anticipates this exact scenario by installing systemic guardrails on non-decommodified essential goods. Historical cost-plus regulations, where companies just lazily pass their bloated internal costs on consumers, were failures. Instead, this matrix uses dynamic indexing. First, we have advanced rent stabilization, which strictly caps annual rent increases at 3% or 60% of regional CPI, completely stopping predatory rent hikes. Next, to tackle pharmaceutical monopolies, they use external price referencing. This benchmarks the price of essential items against average prices in competitive peer countries. Following that, internal reference pricing forces generic alternatives to be discounted 40 to 50% below the originator's price. And finally, emergency price gouging protections place an immediate 10% ceiling on price increases during crises. And this brilliantly illustrates the crucial point. These dynamic mechanisms force corporations to actually become internally efficient to preserve their profit margins, instead of just siphoning the newly acquired purchasing power of the public.
Section 5. Upgrading democracy with sortition. Installing institutional malware protection. The authors recognize a pretty harsh truth here. None of these brilliant economic policies can actually survive if the political system implementing them remains easily corrupted by bad actors. The paper identifies a massive vulnerability in our current representative democracies, a phenomenon called pathocracy. This is a governance system where individuals with pathological traits like psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism successfully capture positions of power. If you've ever watched a political debate and wondered why everyone seems completely disconnected from reality, well, the paper argues this is a mathematical certainty of our system, not just a coincidence. The terrifying reality outlined in the source is that traditional political campaigns actually self-select for these high-conflict, amoral personalities. In our media-saturated environments, their total lack of empathy is often misread by voters as decisiveness, and their pathological narcissism is misconstrued as confidence. They literally have a systemic advantage in winning elections. To fix this, the blueprint proposes what it calls institutional malware protection. Sortition. Sortition is the random selection of ordinary, demographically representative citizens by lot to serve in legislative bodies. It entirely removes competitive elections from the equation. Now, I know it's totally natural to feel a bit uneasy about randomly selected citizens running the government. Nobody wants an incompetent leader, right? But these citizens aren't acting as unchecked dictators. They operate in highly structured environments, carefully guided by adversarial expert panels and robust public debate. Because the vast majority of ordinary citizens are not psychopaths, randomly selecting citizens mathematically dilutes the concentration of sociopathic actors down to negligible levels.
And without campaigns, the influence of dark money, corporate advertising, and media spin is completely neutralized.
So, how does this actually build into real governance models? The paper highlights 3 academic frameworks for this non-electoral system. First up is laudocracy, replacing omnipotent politicians with single-issue citizen juries who make decisions only after hearing from those expert panels. Second is open democracy, large, randomly selected assemblies paired with digital referendums so the broader public can debate online before any final votes are cast. And third is demarchy, highly localized citizens' juries tasked with handling very specific day-to-day neighborhood and city services. By granting only temporary authority to collective boards, you strip leadership roles of all that personal prestige and dominance. This makes public service deeply uninteresting and, frankly, unattractive to power-hungry opportunists.
We have covered a lot of ground today, exploring a highly structured framework that attempts to salvage the mechanics of the market while simultaneously protecting the floor of human existence and the integrity of our democracy. It challenges us to look way beyond the status quo. I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought derived directly from the source material. What could our society achieve if power was no longer a prize for those who crave it? Think about how completely that one single shift would change the trajectory of our future. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the systems around you.